All right, let's crack on. Okay, so all of you already know who I am, but for the sake of the recording, I'm Ramin Lolachi. I, along with Bob Kuliganski, co-lead the Aletheia Apologetics, and today I'm going to talk to you about the topic of exotheology. And because this is Exotheology 101, this is very much a brief and light introduction. And what is exotheology? Exotheology is examining the question of what is the significance to our Christian faith if we were to find extraterrestrial intelligence? And how do we respond to that as Christians? So a little bit of background about myself. I am both a believer and I'm also a planetary scientist. I look at light scattering of moon dust, and I also look for water vapor in the atmosphere of Mars. So I'm based at NASA and work for UMBC. But anyway, enough about me, moving on. So just to sort of give you a brief outline of what we're going to be discussing today, I'm going to start off with some definitions because that's quite a helpful place to start and to try and reduce confusion. Then we're going to move on to talking about a brief history of this, because speculation about extraterrestrial life and extraterrestrial intelligence has been going on a lot longer than you might think. We'll then move on to looking at the Bible. How does extraterrestrial intelligence inform our thinking on creation? And how does extraterrestrial intelligence inform our thinking on redemption? And then we'll sort of sum up. So, as I said, we'll start off with some direct definitions to start helping clear things up. So, we'll start off with extraterrestrial life. So, extraterrestrial life basically means any life form, from an amoeba up to an accountant, outside of Earth that we find on another planet, on another world. Extraterrestrial intelligence is a subset of that, and that is basically finding a sentient being, some complex life form, right up to the scale of something with personhood. So a large step above sort of microbacteria. So in terms of probability, it's fairly likely, the scientific community has the consensus that it's fairly likely that we would find extraterrestrial life within the solar system, but probably not extraterrestrial intelligence. So what do I mean by that? Well, there are certain places within our solar system, such as underground on Mars, or underneath on the oceans of some of the moons of Jupiter and Saturn, Europa and Enceladus, where simple organisms might live. So on Mars you might have these bacteria that sort of live underneath the ground that would have to be protected from the harsh conditions on the surface. The surface conditions of these worlds are very harsh and not amenable to life. Whereas on Europa and Enceladus, you're looking at something like simple life forms that you would find at the bottom of an ocean, similar to things like live around smokers in the abyssal trenches on the Earth's oceans. So that's the kind of thing that scientists speculate they might find within the solar system. But we're certainly not thinking that we're going to find anything above that, anything much more complex than that within our neighbouring planets. On the other hand, if we look much further afield, we might find something. And given how big the universe is and how many worlds there are, the possibility is that there might be something. But it's good to remember that it's a long way from an amoeba to an accountant in terms of complexity. So, as I said, we'll move on to a brief history. The fact is that speculation about life elsewhere outside of Earth has actually been going on for thousands of years. So Plato himself, 2,500 years ago, argued that the maker of the universe distributed souls equal in number to the stars, inserting each in each. So the fact is that this is nothing new. It goes back to the ancient Greeks, and potentially even further. Moving on to another ancient Greek philosopher, we have Democritus. So Democritus is famous for being the founder of atomism. In other words, the idea that matter is, if you took a piece of matter and you kept chopping it up, eventually you get to a point where you can't make it any smaller. And this is sort of the founding idea for where we get modern physics and the idea of the atom, although the atom actually itself does split. But he postulated the idea that the world is made by these atoms coming together and constantly moving and then breaking apart again. And the fact is that this is actually very close to a modern understanding of matter within modern physics. Consequently, because all of the universe is made out of atoms and is made out of matter, the Earth is not a special case, so the combination of matter that happened here may well have happened elsewhere, and that was his idea. And science similarly believes that the matter, the elements that we find here, we find elsewhere in the universe. So that means that the possibilities of finding similar combinations to what we find on Earth are likely. But what do the theologians have to say? Well, the theologians also have been speculating about life outside of Earth for quite a long time. Origen was probably one of the most pro-alien, and so he basically saw a variety of creatures in the universe. Other early theologians believed in the possibility, but were more restrained in their response and wouldn't necessarily commit to saying that God had gone that far, such as John Chrysostom, Athanasius, Basil, and Ambrose. So they believed the idea that God could create other worlds, but were hesitant about whether he had actually done so. And since then, in terms of history, theologians have fallen on both sides of the fence in terms of whether they believe that God has or has not made life elsewhere. In terms of, at this point, it's probably useful to talk a little bit about science. So this is Nicholas Copernicus, a famous Polish astronomer. And he is most famous for essentially helping to prove that the Earth rotated around the Sun. Now, he basically postulated the theory, but the fact is that Galileo is more famous for actually having the proof and showing that this was actually true. So up until this point, the Church and Europe and the Western world believed in the idea of what was known as the geocentric universe. In other words, that the Earth was at the centre and everything else went around the Earth. And this was basically because the Church had adopted Aristotelian cosmology, who had in turn adopted it from Ptolemy. This idea that the Earth is the centre and everything else goes around it. And science up until that point tried to make this fit. But the problem was that over time, evidence came and showed that was not actually the case. And sort of the nail in the coffin for geocentrism was Galileo's observations of the moons of Jupiter and saying that they went around Jupiter itself and not around the Earth. Obviously, this made Galileo very unpopular with the Church. However, Galileo also didn't do himself any favours. But that's a debate for another day. The fact is that we have strong scientific evidence that basically says the Earth is not the centre of the universe and that the Earth goes around the Sun. And that's known as heliocentrism. So that sort of helps set some of the context for what we're going on to where we go now. So in terms of the modern search for extraterrestrial intelligence, most of you have probably heard of an organisation called SETI. And they sort of started searching in the early 1900s with radio waves. And the science and humanity search for finding life elsewhere goes on. And one of the most significant finds to date within this realm is that of exoplanets. So what is an exoplanet? An exoplanet is a planet that orbits around another star, not the Sun. And what we found is that there are basically stars with planets orbiting around them, other solar systems around these other stars. The first one was found in 1995, and since then we've been finding thousands of them, with some of them being known as what's called Earth-like. What does that mean? When we say a world is Earth-like, it's actually it's a bit of a vague definition rather than it exactly being a planet like Earth. What it means is that it's a planet with a similar mass to Earth, and that it's likely to be in what's known as the habitable zone around a star. The habitable zone is that region around a star where liquid water can exist. So if you have a combination of a planet that is about the same size as Earth and is in a region around its parent star where liquid water could form, then it's known as Earth-like and a potential such. We're only just getting to the stage now where we can actually start to look at the chemicals in the atmospheres of these worlds by examining their spectra. But it's there's still a long way to go, and we're finding new things every day. But it's an exciting realm in terms of technology and science. Okay, so what about the Bible? What does the Bible have to say about all of this? So we're going to start looking about creation theology and extraterrestrial intelligence and how we think about creation in light of extraterrestrial intelligence. The fact is that the Bible is actually silent on extraterrestrial intelligence, as I'm sure most of you realise. Now, the fact is that the Bible doesn't speak about dinosaurs, armadillos, or dodos, but we know that we have strong evidence for the existence of all of those. As the theologian M. Worthing says, Christian theology has no biblical or theological basis upon which to reject out of hand the possibility of extraterrestrial life. The argument from silence isn't necessarily an argument, and that's an important thing to bear in mind. It's also good to remember that our God is an extravagant creator. The fact is that when we look around the universe, many of you, I'm sure, have seen pictures from Hubble and some of the amazing things that we see in terms of what God has created in the heavens, or looking close to home, what God has created around us. What we know of God is that he's an extravagant creator with a wonderfully artistic touch. And consequently, we should be open to the idea that God might create elsewhere. The theologian E.A. Milne says, "Is it irreverent to suggest that an infinite God could scarcely find the opportunities to enjoy himself, to exercise his Godhead, if a single planet were the seat of his activities?" Something that's important to bear in mind then, in line with the idea of creation and extraterrestrial intelligence, is our idea of us as humans being made in the image of God and the specialness that entails. Now, there are two ways of looking at this, and that's basically looking at it through the lens of the ancient Greeks or looking at it through the Christian lens. If we look at the Greek view, we're special simply by virtue of place, because the Earth, into the geocentric framework, the Earth was at the centre of the universe, everything went around the Earth, so obviously we were at the centre of everything, so we must be important. But the problem is that we know that is no longer the case. That was dethroned by Copernicus and Galileo. So does that mean we just throw up our hands and we give up and we say, oh, well, we're just the same as everything else? No, it doesn't. If we look at it in terms of the Christian view, we're not special because of where we are. We're special by virtue of God's relationship with us. And importantly, this puts him at the centre. The image of God is about this special, intimate relationship. And you can get hints about the fact that this is so important by how angry God gets with Old Testament idols and these false images of him. Christianity separates specialness from uniqueness, and that's something that's really important and useful to bear in mind. So moving on to redemption and extraterrestrial intelligence. What does it mean? What does redemption mean in the context of extraterrestrial intelligence if we find aliens? How do we think about these aliens and their redemption? So one way to think about it is maybe these aliens are like the angels. They're sinless. They have no need of redemption. But the fact is that given how easy it was for us to make a mistake and muck up, it seems unlikely that they would fare any better off. Another more controversial response to this question is the idea of multiple incarnations of Jesus. So the idea that each race or planet has its own incarnation of Jesus to basically save that race. So little green men have little green Jesus. But the cosmic Jesus seems diminished. It looks too much like a good man. So I think it's important to remember how important Christ is by looking at this text from Colossians, from Colossians 1, verses 15 to 20. He is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. For by him all things were created, in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities. All things were created through him and for him. And he is before all things, and in him all things hold together. And he is the head of the body, the church. He is the beginning, the firstborn from the dead, that in everything he might be preeminent. For in him all the fullness of God was pleased to dwell, and through him to reconcile himself to all things, whether on earth or in heaven, making peace by the blood of his cross. This is something that we should hold in mind when we think about our response to extraterrestrial intelligence, and remembering how important Jesus is, and how glorious he is, and that he is God, not just a good man. Some other responses to the idea of the multiple carnation responses. if you had multiple incarnations of Jesus for other aliens, why not for other cultures on Earth? However, incarnation is not the only method of communication. God communicates through various means, as we see through the Bible. Visions, or at the natural world, angelic visitations, burning bushes, dreams, through the written word, prayer, prophets, and even wrestling. So, does that mean then that Jesus on earth died once for all of creation in the whole universe? Perhaps. Or what is another alternative? Perhaps it's our job to be cosmic missionaries. Perhaps the Grand Commission is for us to go out into the universe. I mean, we've been sending signals out into the heavens since radio began, because every radio signal that's ever been has gone out and travelled out into space. Are we space missionaries? It's a nice idea, but the problem is space is very, very, very large, and it's very getting anywhere takes a very, very long time. I mean, if you think about just the distance to the sun, it takes light from the sun 8 minutes to get here. When you look at the sun in the sky, you're seeing it as it was 8 minutes ago, and that's practically next door. Light travels at 300 million meters a second. That's a lot. That's several times around the world in 1 second. Now, the nearest star to us is 4 light years away, and that's our nearest neighbour. There are about 100 billion stars in the galaxy, and then there are millions of galaxies. The fact is that we just can't do it. It's very unlikely. Perhaps then, God's relationship with these other races is maybe something like Abraham. The fact that Abraham was put right by faith in God before Jesus is born. If we look at James 2:23 and 24, and the scripture was fulfilled that says, Abraham believed God, and it was counted to him as righteousness, and he was called a friend of God. You see that a person is justified by works and not by faith alone. And so I'll leave you with this final word, because the thing is that there are a lot of questions here, and there's a lot of speculation. But what we do know is that God loves, and so he acts, and he will do whatever is necessary. So, just a list of references, and basically most of the work in here actually comes from a book by David Wilkinson in 2013 called Science, Religion, and the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence, which I've basically paraphrased here. So if you want to know more, and obviously there's a lot more to this because we've just skimmed the top of this, I would suggest you have a look at some of those. And with that, I'd like to thank you for listening and ask if you have any questions.
Earlier you said something, there's a difference between specialness and uniqueness.
Yes.
Can you parse that down a little more? What do you mean by that?
So, okay. Uniqueness is simply looking at the frequency of something. You know, like you only have one of it, and so it's rare.
Yeah.
But is something special because it's rare? Like being special, like obviously a lot of the time when we say something is rare, we say that it's special.
Yeah.
But that's a conflation. The two terms don't mean the same thing. It's just that often the case that when something is rare, it is special. But just because something is rare doesn't mean it has to be special. And that's sort of what I meant by that. And so in terms of looking at our position of being at the center of the universe as being a unique thing, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's a special thing.
Yeah.
I hope that helps.
Yeah, I think so.
You mentioned at the beginning that it was good to think about these because it's used sometimes as an attack on the church, and you had kind of talked about like just the sheer surprise of it for Christians, like, but is there anything specific that people either have or you would anticipate people would use regarding extraterrestrial intelligence that would attack the ideas of the church?
Relativism, basically, and an extension of relativism to the cosmic level. So, saying, oh, if we find aliens and they have their own religion, like, why is their religion any less valid? And then, it's the same. It's basically using the same argument as you would for other religions on Earth, and that's one of the ways. That it might be done. Another one might be the idea of, like, obviously Christianity claims that we're made in the image of God, and people might attack that and say, well, these are other special special sentient beings. Why are they any different to you? And then using that as an attack to basically say, well, you're no better than them, so the idea of the image of God probably doesn't apply. Does that make sense? I mean, there are probably other ways as well, but that's just sort of scratching the surface.
Right. People had a really hard time when Heisenberg came up with the uncertainty principle. There was this idea that there were some things that can't be known. It's been interesting how, like, that there have been, like, times in history where there have been specific technological advances that people really did, like, have this crisis of faith and couldn't square what they had thought about Christianity and about God with what this new evidence was. And so I think it is really helpful to try to get at it before it happens. and at least
agreed.
Have thought about these kinds of things.
Yeah. I mean, that's the thing, and it's just so that, if it happens, we're not caught on the back foot. And also, just sort of on that, I mean, it's not just Christians, the scientific community is being caught off guard like this before as well. I mean, a good example would be the Big Bang. So, the Big Bang wasn't really proven until the early 20th century, and before that, the main theory of the idea of the universe was what's called the steady state universe. So basically, the universe had just always existed, and it didn't really look any different to what it looks like now. And then observations started coming out that actually show that there was an expansion, and the astronomer who actually postulated the Big Bang was a guy called George Lemaitre, who's actually a Catholic priest. And when the Big Bang came out, a lot of scientists struggled with it because it looked too religious. Because this idea that, you have a first cause, and it leads to the question of who pressed the button, who started it all. And this is the thing, is like, at the end of the day, scientists are people, and they come with their own biases and their own beliefs. And, the scientific method tries to get past that, but as with anything else, it takes time until the evidence built and built and built. I mean, even the name, the Big Bang itself, was actually a name that was given to it to deride it. It was basically, it's so ridiculous, it's like the Big Bang. But eventually the name stuck, and they reclaimed it and made it a good thing. And also, actually, just going back to the idea of quantum physics and Heisenberg and the uncertainty principle, Einstein was really uncomfortable with quantum physics after helping prove it, because he didn't like the idea of chance and the arbitrary nature that the ideas of quantum physics raised, and then spent a lot of his time trying to disprove it. And is famous for the quote that God does not play dice with the universe. So it's not just Christians who get caught on the back foot by, our increasing knowledge of the universe around us. It's scientists and others as well.
Got to be honest.
Right, well, with that...
something that pops into my head.
Yeah.
This is out of even Corinthians, where Paul tells us eventually that the practices and all that will cease and the book will be closed, right? So in other words, what we've got is God's revelation.
Mm-hmm.
So is a Christian going to be tripped up one day or in some age to come that, God didn't just give his revelation to me, but he's given it to some ETs off in the dark somewhere. Because
Yeah.
we could ask, what about the sincerity or the truthfulness of God's message? Because we are so special and all that.
I think at the end of the day, the Bible basically gives us what we need, and the Bible is concerned about our relationship with God, not others. Because I mean, for instance, the Bible doesn't spend a great deal of time talking about angels' relationship with God, although they obviously have one, because it's not concerned with that. It's concerned with our relationship with God. And similarly, I think it's why it doesn't deal with extraterrestrial intelligence. The fact is, as well, is that although these things might exist, we might never find them, or even if we do, we might never be able to communicate with them because the universe is so large. They might be there, but they might be forever out of reach, or it might take a long time for us to get there, to try and communicate with them. So the fact is that in a lot of ways it doesn't necessarily matter, because God's relationship with those beings is God's prerogative and God's issue with them. It's not something we need to worry about, I think. I mean, obviously this is my personal opinion, and it's speculation on my part.
So what reason would we have to think that otherworldly intelligence would be something of more interest or more like God doesn't really God gives us guidelines for talking to animals, but like treating animals.
Yes.
Like let your plowing oxen eat, as they're plowing and stuff like that. Let them rest on the Sabbath, and like certain kinds of rules for the general care of animals, but nothing salvific, right? Nothing about praying for your animals or like in any kind of relationship with God kind of a thing. I mean, I guess the rocks will cry out too, so it's not that the animals couldn't worship God, but is there any reason to think that it would be a separate category than merely animals? Does that make sense?
Yes. Yeah. No. I see what you're getting. I see what you're getting at. I honestly don't know. Is the answer. But the thing is it's a possibility we ought to be prepared for. And the fact is that there are other beings who are similarly complex that exist within the spiritual realm in terms of the angels. Mm-hmm. So it's not completely out of the question that God has a relationship with other beings.
I see what you mean. I guess those feel very different to me, because the angels are the spiritual realm, and presumably these would be completely physical beings.
Yeah.
Much closer to a gorilla or livestock or something like that than demons that can be loosed or bound. You know what I mean? In different
But I suppose at the same time, there's nothing to stop God from making other beings in His image.
Right.
And I mean, presumably, if the time comes, we would be able to recognize, whether that was the case, whether they were essentially our spiritual siblings.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I was thinking something similar with the redemption. Like there's no means of redemption for angels.
Right.
Yeah, and obviously that's where the comparison with angels breaks down. Yeah, it's not perfect as an analogy, and certainly I'd be the first to admit that.
Category for a intelligent life form that, I don't know how to put this, but is not in God's plan for redeeming.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's basically it's like Kelly was saying, like if we find amoebas elsewhere, we don't need to worry about their salvation. I mean, what happens between the amoebas and God is between God and the amoebas.
Right. I'm thinking specifically intelligent.
But in terms of intelligent, I mean, I think the problem is we can only speculate.
Yeah, it's
because
all speculation.
all of this is speculation, and until
it's not.
until it's not exactly.
Because we have life
So
forms.
does this fall into Paul's reminding us about the futility of human philosophy
We were just talking about that on the way over here.
Oh my, I must have overheard the conversation.
No, it's just funny. We were talking about a completely different context,
But yeah, I mean, the thing is obviously not to get carried away with any of this. You know, I'm not saying you should go away and pray for ET. What I'm saying is just that it's something worth thinking about, but not being overly worried about or being obsessed about. And mostly, the point of my message today is just to show you that there really isn't anything to worry about.
yeah, it doesn't affect. So I think it's more helpful when someone who's a skeptic comes up and goes, well, you know, eventually we're going to find intelligent life, and that's going to like destroy your faith system.
Yeah, exactly, and it's basically it's trying to equip folks for that and being able to respond to those situations. Right.
You said there are exotheologians, though.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of them do.
Dedicated kind of their study
Well,
to
yeah, some of them. So I mean, the guy who wrote the book, David Wilkinson, for instance, he does that, and yeah, so he's the head of theology at Cranmer College in of Durham University. But he's also he's both a theologian and an astrophysicist. And then you have other people who've speculated on this, like John Polkinghorne as well. But it's actually been going on for quite a long time, and as you said, you know, there have been a number of other theologians, very famous ones, who've touched upon this idea, and it sort of continues out throughout the medieval period as well.
I had never thought about it until like, oh, Ron's going to talk about it.
I suppose, yeah. I mean, I'm sort of pushed in this direction given my job.
your world, yes.
Yeah, it is very much within my orbit. No pun intended. Well, pun intended. All right. Well, with that, folks, I think we can say good night and thank you very much for coming.
This is the last one.